Anna Kate Lemke, and I'm doing the Champions Brief topic analysis for the March 2020 public forum topic, which is resolved the United States should increase its use of nuclear energy for commercial energy production. So let's start off by breaking down the resolution and defining some terms. The first thing we should look to is the actual wording of the resolution itself. And usually the first thing I look for is who the actor in the resolution is. So in this case, it pretty clearly says that the actor is the United States of America, which means that teams can only talk about the implementation of nuclear energy within America. So that means that teams can talk about impacting out to like the whole world, or if there are like any spillover effects from America actually implementing nuclear energy. But America is the starting place and America is the actor in this resolution. So you have to only think about what's going to happen if America implements it. So then the next thing that is of note in this resolution is the word should. That means that teams are arguing whether America has a moral obligation to implement nuclear energy, which means that teams can focus on whether it's like good or bad for nuclear energy to be implemented, and possibly argue that more so than like implementation aspects or anything like that. That's up for teams to decide. But I think that it's probably fair game to try to ignore some implementation aspects or to diminish implementation arguments in favor of arguments about just the general benefits or downsides to implementing nuclear energy. So those are the only things I really thought were of note in the wording of the resolution itself. But now comes time for some definitions. And so so let's start with just defining nuclear energy really quickly. So the quick scientific definition of what nuclear energy is that nuclear energy is the energy in the nucleus of an atom. And so basically how this works is that there's a ton of energy in the bonds that hold atoms together. But like to access this energy and to be able to harness this energy, the bonds have to be, or the energy has to be released. And the way we get this is for a process called nuclear fission, where atoms are split apart, so they get the energy from the bonds being broken. And so to generate nuclear energy, you need a nuclear power plant. And that's definitely something that's going to come up in debates, is the fact that like nuclear energy does inherently have to be created within a nuclear power plant. And there are some like good sides and bad sides to just like the plant in general. But then also something probably to note also is that right now, nuclear energy makes up about 19% of the energy within America. And we'll get to what constitutes the other like 80% in a little while. But for right now, that's all you need to know about nuclear energy. It's not super complicated. And then another thing to define in the resolution is commercial energy. So commercial energy is the energy which is directly available in the market for a definite price. So this energy forms the basis of industrial, agricultural, transportation, and commercial development in the modern world. And so like some examples of it are electricity, coal, like natural gas, anything that gives you energy that has a definitive price that can be purchased. And this makes up most of the energy that you see in like the markets. So before we get into like the actual argumentation and like going through both sides, let's talk just a bit about like what each world is advocating for. So let's start off with just the current energy situation within America. And also something that's really crucial to this debate is the current climate situation overall in the whole world. So currently there is obviously a worldwide dilemma concerning climate change. And so climate change is really, really important, and it's a huge impact. And a lot of scientists think that we're basically that the world is on the brink of like not being able to recover a lot of the damages that we've done with climate change. So that lends a certain like urgency to this resolution, especially because a lot of it will be discussing climate issues and what's best for the environment. And so but so that's useful to keep in mind, just because a lot of impacts will be like very broadly to the environment, and a lot of debates I think will come down to who helps the environment or who can like mitigate climate change the best. So if you're arguing affirmative, you are advocating for a world where America actively expands on the amount of energy or the amount of nuclear energy that's being used for commercial energy. That's just what the resolution says. Remember, right now we're at about 20% nuclear energy for America. The other 80% are made up by like fossil fuels and things like that. So in the neg world, you're defending a world where we continue with our current energy production. For some background that might be helpful on this, currently in America, we get about 64% of our total energy from fossil fuels. This is important, especially in terms of the climate change debate, because fossil fuels are bad for the environment. Fossil fuels have contributed significantly to climate change. They're one of the foremost causes of climate change. So a big part of the affirmative strategy is to talk about how we need to decline the amount of fossil fuels we use, like as much as possible. Like that is probably the absolute critical thing in the AF world. And so if you're AF, you're arguing that nuclear energy is the best way to do this. If you're neg, you also probably don't want to be advocating for nuclear energy. So you will probably be wanting to advocate that renewables are a better solution. But this is pretty much, I think, all the background you need for this topic. So we can talk a little bit about some basic argumentation. We're going to start with AF, and the main arguments are in general that nuclear energy is good. And so the reason it's good has a lot to do with its impact on the environment. So the first thing teams might argue is that nuclear energy is cleaner for the environment, because nuclear energy, it leads to less radiation than any other energy form. This is really good because it's putting less things into the atmosphere. But then nuclear energy also has the least effect on nature, since it doesn't discharge any gases like methane and carbon dioxide, which are the primary like greenhouse gases that you hear about that are like so detrimental to the climate, and that cause like so many bad impacts, that cause like a lot of pollution and a lot of deaths through climate change also. Another way you can argue for nuclear energy being good for the environment is that there's less land wasted. So there's like a very compelling anecdote that I found while researching that says that an unbroken line of 50-story wind turbines along the 2,000-mile Appalachian Trail would produce no more electricity than 4 nuclear reactors on 4 square miles. So as you can see, there is definitely like a trade-off if you're using renewable energy like wind power, in terms of the amount of land that it takes up. So like the problem with using a ton of land is that it probably is going to like ruin certain environments. It comes at the cost of ecosystems. It comes at the cost of having to develop previously possibly undeveloped land. So a big way that nuclear energy cuts down on that is that it just necessitates far less land for like a nuclear reactor site. Another way that you can argue for for nuclear energy is that it's cheaper. So like there's a misconception, I think, that nuclear energy is like really expensive, and that like if we have to like go all to nuclear energy, it's going to basically like totally like run America's like budget into the ground, and it's totally infeasible because it's too expensive. But actually, like once the cost barrier probably comes in when you have to develop new nuclear reactors. Now, that's definitely something that the neg side wants to look into, because it might be infeasible or it might put a large strain on a budget to try to develop all these new nuclear reactor sites. But what you can also see is that once we have these nuclear reactor sites, the maintenance costs for the power plants are way less, because the plants operate way more efficiently and more consistently than like fossil fuel plants. So it's this trade-off, like long-term versus short-term probably, where both sides should look into whether like whether the long-term like money saved through like maintenance and through like the efficiency of nuclear energy production outweighs the like starting cost of implementing an actual or like building an actual power plant. I also think that it's something that I think that that's definitely something you could look into. But then also, renewables are not as cheap as people say. Nuclear energy is actually the cheapest, like, once you have your nuclear reactor to develop. The only reason, and like you might run into, AF teams might run into neg teams that say like, no, you've got it all wrong, like look how inexpensive renewables are. But AF teams need to be aware that the reason why a lot of renewables are actually inexpensive is because they're heavily subsidized by the government. And so that just means that like renewables aren't actually that cheap. They're actually fairly expensive in the long term. Like nuclear energy is way cheaper to produce than renewables. So AF teams, as you can see, like have a few routes to say why nuclear energy is not only preferable to fossil fuels, which is like pretty clear on an environmental level. Nuclear energy does seem to be pretty much proven to be superior to fossil fuels, but also it seems to be better than renewable energy because of these problems with the environment and problems with like getting land for renewables and the fact that the government has to heavily subsidize renewables. So you can see how nuclear energy seems like it could be a very like sustainable alternative. But now let's talk, and then another thing with nuclear energy is that it actually enjoys a lot of public support, as a pretty, like, not gonna lie, a dated Gallup poll says that 62% of Americans favored nuclear energy over the idea of renewables. And so that just means that there's like not going to be that much public pushback to nuclear energy if it was implemented, which is a good thing for AF teams, because you don't have to deal with any public backlash. People are ready for nuclear energy, and I'm sure you can look up like more recent polls. That one was from 2010, but I'm sure you can look up a more recent poll, and it doesn't seem like it would have switched. But let's now talk about neg for a little while. So a lot of neg arguments and a lot of the neg world concerns itself about the actual implementation and management of these nuclear sites. A lot of times, a lot of the downsides to nuclear plants do seem to be kind of in terms of the structure of the plant itself, as well as like where you would put it. So the first argument that actually kind of contradicts, or at least contrasts, one of the arguments I talked about for AF is that implementation for nuclear energy could potentially be really difficult in the future. That's because nuclear power plants need to be built in very specific places. They need to be built somewhere where there's like cool, I think it's like cool wind, and it needs to be like by a body of water. You should look up to see the actual like criteria of where they should be put. But what I've read is that there seems, a lot of people think that there might not be enough spaces to build these reactors to generate enough energy. So people think that even if nuclear energy is a good idea, it doesn't seem feasible to implement it as widely as people want, because of the fact that there might not be enough sites, like literally in America, to develop this. But then they also say that nuclear energy could be dangerous. So this is for a few reasons. The first is nuclear waste. So what is nuclear waste? Nuclear waste is the material that nuclear fuel becomes after it's used in a reactor. And the reason why this is a downside is because it's really hard to dispose of, and it's actually a very hazardous substance. It stays poisonous and hazardous to the environment for about like 1,000 years after it's produced. So obviously with something like that, you need to have a really surefire disposal method, which is something that doesn't seem to have been implemented yet for nuclear waste. So if you look up like examples of how to dispose of nuclear waste, there are a lot of suggestions, and all of them seem to be pretty terrible. Like, I think the only one that actually got implemented was dumping nuclear waste into the ocean, which like clearly had to be shut down because that's just incredibly hazardous to the environment. Just because, you know, you put the thing that's like hazardous for 1,000 years out of sight doesn't mean that it's still hazardous, but in a new place. So it's ruining ecosystems in the ocean. So that was shut down, and now it seems that most nuclear waste is put in concrete, like huge concrete or steel drums, and then buried. The problem with this is that you can still see like leakage, you can still see problems with this, and then because the material is so hazardous, you actually have a risk of even ruining environments past when you've buried the nuclear waste, if it gets out or if it leaks or anything. This makes like bad changes in the environment. Obviously, it kills animals. So if America transitioned to be increasingly more and more so involved in like nuclear energy production, there would obviously have to be steps taken to ensure that like there was a very clear way of how to deal with nuclear waste, and it doesn't seem like anybody has that yet, and it seems like that's something that is absolutely essential before we actually can proceed with nuclear energy. Then the next way people say that nuclear energy is dangerous or the next few ways are actually more of like the jobs itself and like the plants itself. So the next way is through nuclear accidents. So I'm sure that most of y'all have heard about Chernobyl. This was an incident where there was basically a nuclear meltdown at a plant, and some estimates put the death toll at about 15,000 because of it, because of exposure, because of people who got cancer afterwards. And so this argument, I think, actually, these accidents aren't super common, but they do occur sometimes, and they carry, I think, or could carry quite a bit of weight in rounds because people are very familiar with them. People are very familiar with the Chernobyl incident, and just because it did only happen once, but how it happened and the scale to which it happened makes it a far scarier event than you would actually think it is, due to its frequency. So because of that, it might be a pretty compelling argument for many judges, especially if they're a bit older and remember or have a large knowledge of Chernobyl. So then the next way that it's that nuclear plants could be dangerous is working in nuclear plants. So there are some studies that indicate that there might be a higher risk of cancer from working within nuclear plants. This obviously is a bad thing and is a pretty strong neg argument if they can make it convincingly. There is something to be said about maybe there's increasing regulation in the nuclear industry. AF teams can argue quite a few things about how, people choose to work in the nuclear industry, but also if the nuclear energy sector is expanding as it would be in the AF world, there are now more and more of these jobs opening up, so more and more people might get actually pushed into them. That's an interesting debate, I think, that could happen about the workers themselves. There's also some studies that indicate that there might not be an increased risk of cancer due to working in nuclear plants. It's definitely something to look into, but the impact of this one is pretty clear, and if you can access it, I think that it's very good for a terminal impact in rounds, because an increase in cancer is obviously a huge threat to human life, and we want to avoid that if possible. So then the next way that it can be dangerous that people fear is that it could be a target for terrorist attacks. So I think it was Al-Qaeda that actually listed or reportedly listed a nuclear plant as a place that they would be interested in attacking. So that argument has a lot of fear instilled within it. You know, the idea of somebody orchestrating a terrorist attack on a nuclear plant, it would be catastrophic. Now, AF teams do have history as their friend in this one. Terrorists don't attack power plants. AF teams would definitely want to look into why they don't, as would neg teams, because maybe it's capability, but maybe it's just, you know, there's still the danger of it. I don't really know. There might be more evidence on that out there, but I think if you can find that evidence, it's another really good argument. Because again, the magnitude of it, if it did happen, would be enormous. It would be really disastrous for any attack to occur on a nuclear power plant. So those are just some quick arguments about the March 2020 topic. I hope that everybody does well at tournaments, and good luck.